Hello again, and welcome to Lam Rim. So this week we're doing chapter 16, and but first let's try to do what we can to set our motivation and consider the purpose of this practice. The purpose of the Buddhist practice is to achieve enlightenment, and from Mahayana practitioner, then what we're looking to do is to do that in order to benefit everybody. So we work out, and we can consider recognizing that if we suffer, everybody suffers, and developing from a development of cherishing mind, loving kindness, consideration, recognizing the family, that we are going to burden responsibility for the suffering of all, and in doing so, we will become a Buddha. So that's what this is for. So last week we talked a little bit about the emptiness of emptiness, and how some of the modes of emptiness. And again, this time what we wanted to do is to look specifically at understanding how to identify the object of the object of negation, what it is that we're saying is not present. So emptiness just means not present, and what we're saying is, well, what is it that's not present? That's what we need to understand. So before I start on that, last week, I think if you were very keen-eared, you may have heard that I said tattva, and I think I said tattva once or twice, and if I did, what I meant was tathata. So this is suchness. And suchness, tathata is like tathagata, so this same meaning, that one gone beyond. Anyway, so in this session, like the others where we're discussing insight, we're going to be using these words again and again, and rather than me repeat them again and again, I think it's probably better for me to, in retrospect, to sort of just prefix the talk with the fact that these words all mean the same sort of thing. So like intrinsic nature, inherent existence, inherent essence, outside of any context, objective truth, independently established. So all of these things really are talking about the same thing, which is a fiction. And also we can talk about self in the context of selflessness. So this is the idea of selflessness is anatman or anatta, if one's used to Pali. And then the idea of this self, in this particular case, is also the object of negation, what it is that we're trying to see the absence of, if you like. So because these words are all, well, many of these words, and certainly these phrases, are specialist, and they're sort of not words that we sort of learn in our normal daily life, such as inherent existence, or, I mean, maybe you do, but I certainly haven't. So then in that sense, it's really useful for us to try to have some sort of handle on them. For me, without a strong academic background in philosophy, for instance, I've struggled a lot with these words. So for instance, being a Londoner, I see the word like inherent as being similar to in here, in it. Yeah, so in here, ain't it, or it is similar sort of to inherent. So when we're talking about inherent, or we're saying it's in here, it exists in its, or it is in its own way. It is on its own side. So this is what I sort of understand when I hear inherent, and it helps me to think it's in here, in it, right? So maybe that doesn't help, but for you, but for me, it can be quite useful to think about these things. However, this particular chapter is going to explore this particular issue, and one of the main things about using words that we're not very familiar with doesn't help us in terms of our understanding of emptiness. So this is really important for us to recognize, that it's not just that we have to learn these words, and we must get used to these sort of philosophical concepts, but actually what we need to do is to not get too tangled up with the words and understand what the issue is, such that we can deal with this issue more seriously. What the chapter is about, chapter 16, not negating enough, is like when we strive to identify selflessness specifically, our understanding might leave some sort of whisper of something in it, or something which doesn't really eliminate completely our ignorance, right? So our ignorance, the idea is our ignorance is casting this sort of imputing this fog across what we can, what we perceive in a way which makes us feel that we can grasp at things, and it's legitimate for us to grasp at things, grasp at ourselves, find ourselves precious. So a bit maybe like Gollum, precious, my precious. So this mind of preciousness in terms of wanting to hold, grasp onto it, keeps us bound to suffering, according to the Buddha's teachings on the 12 interdependent links. So therefore, what we're doing is we're trying to let go of that clinging, that grasping that's actually very painful and toxic for us. And in order to do that, what we need to do is to see that the basis of our clinging, the way in which we see things, is that they are non-graspable. They're not available for us to grasp onto. Both in terms of their nature, but also in terms of their facility, their ability to provide us what it is that we are hoping to find within them. So we've got to be careful that when we're doing our insight meditation, when we're actually looking at this ourselves in detail, that what's left doesn't allow for some sort of subtle holding on. But then the other thing is, so this is one way in which we've got to be careful of not negating enough. Another way is also to think that strange words such as intrinsic existence or inherent existence and so on, or inherent nature, might provide for us some sort of philosophical or intellectual understanding or intellectual analysis, but that leaves us in a place which is far from changing or radically altering our immediate experience. So if we are finding ourselves in our meditation on emptiness struggling with philosophical ideas rather than struggling with identifying ourself and the absence of ourself in the way in which it is described, then we're missing the point. So we've got to be careful not to become sort of involved in intellectuality or in terms of just philosophy or idle. Oh, I wonder what about this and that, and instead think about how is this actually changing? How is this enabling this? How is this actually empowering me? So what this means is that neither of these can be the case if we're looking for a revolutionary change within ourselves. Okay, so if we were looking for enlightenment, we neither want to miss the boat, miss the point, nor do we want to end up just in some sort of intellectual game. So somebody objects slightly or says, well, what do you mean? I mean, essentially, the object to be negated is very well established. This is the self is well established in texts such as Nagarjuna's key core text, the fundamental treatise, or Mulamadi Mikakarika. And they say there are these three attributes. It doesn't arise from causes and conditions, therefore, because it is independent. It is permanent, not prone to continual change that leads to dissolution, and it has a singular nature of its own. It's non-composite. So there are reasonings behind those are dealt with elsewhere, but essentially these are these three aspects that Nagarjuna describes as being relevant to any object to be negated in this sense. So, but Rinpoche is going to answer this as saying, well, yeah. So if we're pointing out merely that a consequence of inherent existence, or a consequence of the object that we call self, is that it has a consequence. A consequence would be that it isn't containing causes and conditions. A consequence being that it is a permanent, and a consequence being that it's a singular. It has this singular nature. It's non-composite. Then that's absolutely right. So when we're asking the question, right, what does it mean to be inherently existent, then this sort of answer is well answered with this sort of question. But we've got to understand what this selflessness looks like. So not just so much to do with what it entails, or what are the consequences of it, but how does it look like? How does it feel? So this thing that binds us, this ignorance that binds us to ignorance, we need to understand that, and we need to understand just how it manifests to us, ourselves, and also how it binds us to suffering, right? So, so it's not just using this word of inherent existence or impermanent or composite. We need to think about saying, well, this self, this inherent existence we're talking about, how is it that it actually appears to us? And how does it appear when we are governed by this ignorance such that it binds us? Right? I think I'm slightly repeating myself here. So if we like, in terms of thinking about it, in terms of the ignorance that binds us to samsara, what we're saying is, what is it? How is it? And what does it look like? This underlying cause of all suffering, this ignorance. How does it appear? How does it hide from us? What is that? So when we recognize what that is and what it feels like, how it appears in our life, then we're in a position to understand and demonstrate to ourselves that this apparent object is unavailable, impossible, and therefore fabricated. Yeah. So in the same way that we can demonstrate to ourselves that a living adult elephant can't be found in a small first-room floor of a narrow Victorian house like where I am now, we can use this reasoning, but we need to identify what it is that we are looking at. So when we get there, then we also see it's not only merely absent. It's not as if it's just merely absent. It's actually cannot be absent. It's naturally absent. It's impossible that this mode of being, or this essence that we presuppose or imagine, is unavailable. It cannot be there for us. And when we see that clearly, when we are able to give rise to that, the self as it appears, as ignorance presents it to us, and then recognize that it is impossible, then we are beginning to work directly on our insight. So one of the aspects of this, and I think this was really going on about last week, was we can't just merely empty our mind and expect ourselves to recognize mind in its sort of natural state. Mind in its natural state is ignorant. It is also freely, if you like, and it also we are already free from intrinsic existence in terms of the fact that intrinsic existence is a fiction, it's a fabrication. So just resting in that state doesn't lead us into recognizing how we are bound, and this is the distinction that's made between serenity or calm abiding, or samatha, where we're concentrating on a very deep level, and insight, where we're directly examining with our mind, experientially examining with our mind in a way which determines what cannot be. So therefore, in brief, we must recognize how not only that phenomena lack this self that we presuppose it, this inherent nature, but we also must recognize it in light of how it is, such that we can eliminate our mistaken view. So if once we can do that, when we understand how it causes a toxic behavior in us, then we can work out why we must eliminate it. We can see it, then we can work out how to demonstrate it doesn't work, and then we can actually see some progress. So the point that Rinpoche is making here is that if we think that the definition of the three criteria of being independent, being permanent, being solitary, is enough for us to identify inherent existence, it sort of strongly suggests that the intellectual musing somehow established direct insights. So noticing, for instance, the non-existence of some intellectual or philosophical term isn't going to do much for us. This point being is we've got to recognize that when I say an impermanent existent or an intrinsic existent, the entity or an inherent object cannot be. This is sort of, in a sense, becomes quite intellectual for us, because it certainly does for me. And we need to be able to say, well, look, that's great, but I actually need to get rid of that and allow myself to work out, get rid of it in terms of the intellectuality, but use it and understand it in a way which I can apply to my experience. So essentially, if we're noticing the non-existence of some sort of intellectual entity, it's not going to help. It's not going to do much for us. So we've got to work out how to notice that this is how we see things. And within the Madhyamaka, this school, how the school or the tradition, this particular insight practice, assists in pointing out what is that is not. What we see that is not really there. I'm not trying to be like what is not. Now, of course, in the don't want to lose my page. So, of course, we find in many Prajnaparamita and many Madhyamaka texts, we find this idea of saying that, well, if things have an essence, then they can't depend upon causes and conditions. If they have an essence, then they must be unitary. If they have an essence, then they cannot change from moment to moment. And there's all the reasonings that give out as to why that is the case. And all of these arguments, while being very good, cannot, they're all in relationship to if things inherently exist. And while they point out those the consequences of inherent existence, then and are very useful, they don't really reveal our experience or our presumption that the thing that I see present appears in a way via ignorance. So what we need to do in order to empower or bring meaning to the reasoning is to recognize how the words link to our experience. But yeah, if things are as they appear to be, then all of those arguments do follow without issue. And so the point is being able to use these arguments once we've identified the object. Then we can use these arguments to demonstrate its absence. So again, and in clarity here, Rinpoche talks about pot, but I'm going to talk about the blue mug here, because props are good, I think. So just as this is continuously subject to being broken, it's continuously impermanent, it's continually changing due to its being a product. In other words, it's composite, it's made of different bits and pieces. We can recognize that it's not unitary. There's a handle and the cup part and so on, and the blue part and so on. So all of these things show that it's not unitary, and the fact it's obviously created by a potter out of clay and so on shows that it's made of various different causes and conditions. So we don't define it as we don't look at this and think in terms of our natural mind, normal mind. We don't look at that and say, oh, will you pass me that impermanent product or that apparently intrinsic entity, right? It just doesn't happen. And when if we wanted to define it, we wouldn't define it even as an impermanent product. We define it as a mug or a blue mug. And if we wanted to really be more specific, we might say a cylindrical container for drinking from, having a handle and somewhat covered with blue glaze. I don't know. This is just an example. So therefore, we can say that being a product, it must be impermanent, but impermanent doesn't describe it. So what we're relating to is the blue mug, and while we might identify its impermanence as being one of its qualities, if you like, that doesn't necessarily help us with understanding what it is about the blue mug that we are resist or impose upon it. So again, when we subject these things to analysis, we conclude that something that if it did exist ultimately, objectively, it would have to be non-composite and partless, as I said earlier on. But we don't also consider this to be a partless thing, right? So in that sense, the thing that I'm trying to negate, if I was trying to negate a partless a partless thing or an impermanent thing, then it's like, does this actually make sense to me? Because it's like, well, the mug's still there. So partless thing isn't how we overlay the nature that binds us to suffering and its consequences that we might discover through reasoning. So in that sense, we've got to we don't through ignorance experience partless things. We don't through ignorance experience impermanent things. We experience mugs and cups and elephants and so on. So again, and Rinpoche is slightly repeating, but we want to get this very clear. Partless things are an acquired consequence that we might discover through reasoning. Through learning philosophical understandings, or we might learn it in Euclidean mathematics, for instance. So there are different areas where we might learn about partless products and partless entities and so on. But essentially, in terms of the way in which we relate to things around us, normally that's not the case. And when we do use those other mechanisms, it tends to be within a different framework where we're looking at a sort of abstract model or a discussion about the nature of reality and some sort of intellectual dinner party, So, and in inclusion again, so while the object of negation itself might be partless, it's not good enough as a term or as an aspect to define our experiential perceptual overlay as being partless, and certainly not in terms of the thing that keeps us stuck. And Rinpoche says again, if like, even if we had a perfectly clear and direct awareness of the truth that ultimately things must be partless, and that partless things have no inherent nature, and therefore must be fabricated, if you like, it won't help shift our ignorance, because it's just too intellectual for us. It's become too abstract, too distant from the way in which we actually experience the world. So Rinpoche makes the point of saying that our principal task, our primary task for insight, is that we don't get lost in philosophizing. Yeah, we've got to experientially recognize the thought in the way in which it appears. And we do it and then use that to, in an unmistaken and a transformative manner, in a way which actually identifies it. Then we can do the appropriate analysis to demonstrate that such an appearance is faulty because it necessitates a fiction. Then our second task is to eliminate any acquired wrong views that we may have accumulated, or which confuse our understanding, or is just not relevant at all. So again, he says, if we get it wrong, then when we're refuting a personal self, when we're trying to do our practice, when we're trying to eliminate this self-grasping, we may have developed sort of mental muscle, if you like, for the ability to demonstrate the absence of a permanent or unitary and independent intrinsic nature, but we'll be completely led by the nose of our ignorance. So this aspect is really important to us. When what we're trying to do is to get rid of being led by the nose of our ignorance, rather than sort of Pinocchio comes to mind, but rather than having some great intellectual capacity. And if we're doing this, and we're basically, all we're doing is refuting the views acquired from philosophy or similar, all we're doing is merely engaging in an intellectual game. And Rinpoche goes on to say that when we do that, that if we think that playing some intellectual game or freeing ourselves from philosophically acquired views will lead to enlightenment, it's just a complete mistake. Being able to say, oh yeah, I no longer hold on to, for instance, the view of Hindu Atman or a Christian soul, doesn't liberate us. It just frees us from what on our side we consider to be mistaken views. So this sort of analysis doesn't free us from suffering at all. And he's saying, essentially, we don't learn ignorance. We don't learn to be ignorant. We're born ignorant. It comes naturally to us in terms of the fact that we have to work to eliminate our ignorance. We haven't worked to gain our ignorance. So this is a point, in the sense we talked last week, I think, or the week before, the last session, the session before, we talked about how our senses are naturally ignorant. So it's very, very deeply ingrained. And what we are not going to do is to directly work on our senses. We're going to be working on our mind. Then the mind itself helps to shift because of the if you like, the plasticity of the brain. The mind will help shift the perception of our senses very gradually over time. But initially, we are going to have direct perception, experiential perception of a lack of self in terms of selflessness mentally. So yeah, and he says it's absurd. It's absurd for us to claim one can overcome our innate afflictions by recognizing the non-existence of acquired misconceptions, right? So just because we've managed to get rid of some acquired misconceptions about the world, I don't know where from, but anywhere, once we've got rid of those, that doesn't somehow free us from samsara. So, and he cites Chandrakirti. He says, when learning selflessness, some eliminate a permanent self, but we do not consider this to be the basis of the conception I, in terms of the one that we hold on so preciously. It is therefore astonishing to claim that knowing this selflessness would expunge and uproot the view of self. So this sort of aspect is, Rinpoche is saying, look, it's not just me making this up. And this is Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti is a very, very senior and highly respected scholar of the Middle Way school. And again, he sort of says it's completely irrelevant. Trying to sort of, if we haven't got the right view of what it is that we're eliminating, if we haven't identified correctly what it is that we're destroying, and we've caught up in some sort of intellectuality, or we've caught up in the idea that it's an acquired view, or that it's something that we've learned rather than is native within us, we're missing the point. And he uses the aspect of this separateness in a metaphor, an analog. He says somebody sees a snake living in the wall, and his friend, in order to try to ease his worry, says, "Look, there's no elephant here." So to others, meanwhile, it's ridiculous to imagine that telling your friend that there's no elephant here will somehow eliminate the fear of the snake. And then Rinpoche goes on to say about this that although Chandrakirti in these two verses is talking about self in terms of noticing the emptiness of self, of the person, this is also true about objects. All things, everything, all phenomena are selfless. They're free of this intrinsic, inherent in it. Existence inherent in it. So up until this point, Rinpoche has been, we have been talking about that, or recognizing we've got to understand the object of negation experientially and not intellectually. And also that philosophical or intellectual views, either Buddhist or non-Buddhist, are not what blind us to suffering. So it's not neither philosophical or intellectual views, and neither is it some sort of intellectual game that we need. We need to have an experiential understanding to shift us, to shift our mind, to shift where we are. So then Rinpoche is going to be spending a little bit more, again, we have a slight shift in the emphasis here, and he's going to be talking about nature. So nature in this case, there are sort of two different definitions of nature. I mean, there's like all languages, so you have words like nature often have different meanings in them, and in both Pali and Sanskrit, nature is one of these words. Now what's sort of confusing or lacks clarity necessarily is that one of the natures is this non-existent, the idea of this inherent inherent in it nature, or inherent in it objective truth that we impose by our ignorance. And this is known as a nature in terms of the idea that it's something we think is there. So that sort of nature, that meaning is a fabrication, it's a fiction. But the other way in which we talk about nature is the absolute, the ultimate way, or the fundamental way in which things really are. So it's in this particular, the second meaning, that Rinpoche wants to spend some time on. So the query is that, well, essentially Nagarjuna talks about the defining characteristics of nature, not being fabricated, not depending upon something else. And the question is, does this actually exist? So so again, citing Sutra, Chandrakirti points out that, in fact, yes, this nature is the reality, this reality of the world, if you like. Tathata, suchness, right? So, and the point about suchness is that whether or not Tathagatas appear, whether or not there are Buddhas, the reality of phenomena remains. But what is this reality? So this reality we're talking about, we're talking about what isn't. And then I'm saying, okay, well, this ultimate, the fundamental reality of underneath it all, behind our perceptions, behind our ignorance, is there a reality, and it exists, and what is it? Can we really say it exists? What does that mean? So it's, the nature of things such as these eyes, the mind, elephants, mugs, all of these things. The nature of these things is that is itself not fabricated nor dependent upon something else. And if that nature didn't exist, why would we practice? So then, of course, the question is, well, didn't you just argue that all nature lacked in all phenomena, including tathatas and so on, all of these things lack intrinsic nature, intrinsic existence? And the answer is yes, that's absolutely right. Including this nature that we're just talking about, it also lacks intrinsic existence. It's beyond our perception. It doesn't matter, internal or external, imaginary or not, nothing holds intrinsic in nature. So the ultimate nature, the final mode of being, if you like, itself, tathata, is free of intrinsic nature. So the final nature is unfabricated, fundamental entity which is always present. It doesn't depend upon causes and consequences, nor on relativity such as here, there, now, then, or so on like this. Does a blue mug have this nature? Well, it doesn't essentially have it, because that would be a mistake. It doesn't essentially lack it. So Chandrakirti says, it exists conventionally. So right now, this is probably like, hang on, what? So all this time we've been talking about nothing having intrinsic nature. Now we're saying that yes, there's tathata, which is this underlying reality, and that also lacks intrinsic nature. So one of the things about it, in terms of the way in which Chandrakirti says it, he says, in order to avoid frightening you or my audience, I say it exists conventionally. And then, of course, the objection is well, he's not saying it conventionally exists. He's saying that's just in order to stop us from being frightened. He's saying it really doesn't exist. And Rinpoche replies saying, no, look, it can only exist conventionally. And the reason why it exists conventionally has been established elsewhere. In fact, we established it, I think, last week or the week before, which is that being an absence, if you like, it is still subject to being non-intrinsic. So in terms of this, is also saying is that in order to attain nirvana, we must perceive nirvana. In order for us to be able to, nirvana means the absence of the causes of suffering and suffering itself. So the absence of suffering and its causes. Once we have managed to stop it, cease it completely, we have a cessation. The cessation of the causes of the suffering and its causes. This is nirvana. So nirvana is a true cessation, and true cessations are ultimate truths. They're final. So if they didn't exist, we couldn't attain them. So that's true when we're talking about cessations, but compounded phenomena like this, they're not natures in the sense of being ultimately existent, nor and they are also not natures when we recognize reality as being the final nature or fundamental underlying nature. So there's two different meanings of nature we were talking about earlier on. But ultimate truths are natures. So when we're talking about the final nature or the final mode of existence, what establishes them is that they are non-fabricated and don't depend upon something else. They don't exist as in any way as being natures, in the sense of being essentially existence. They don't exist as a sort of essential existence. The mode of existence which is essential is a fiction always. So yes, we are talking about what is beyond our senses, if you like, and what we're saying is that this thing exists, but it doesn't exist essentially. Therefore, they exist conventionally. So then this point is again that our path, our journey, is to perceive the final nature of reality, right? But the meaning of nature is not the fictional essential existence, which is what we're currently obscuring us. So it's just the natural mode in which everything is, yeah, free of ignorance that imposes that ignorance. The natural mode exists, but when we are talking about it as being such and such, existing, we're limited by the language we use. So, and language likes us to push to extremes. It's like, it got to be real or it's not real. But things, phenomena which are composite, subject to causes and consequences, such as the mug, neither have don't have the fictional nature that we're talking about in terms of what ignorance superimposes, nor are they in their natural mode. And it's because that they're not either type of nature, we use a sort of natural mode or final nature or ultimate nature to mean the goal of the path. Reality as it is. Experiencing reality as it is. Because there is a final nature, we have a path. And that involves us working to achieve something. And that something is the perception of this final nature, which is nirvana. So then Rinpoche, citing from Chandrakirti again, somebody says, oh, this is wrong. How can we say that there are no real things, but then say there's an unfabricated and independent nature? How is this just not a contradiction? And Chandrakirti replies, well, we've got to recognize that in terms of critical aspects of our insight meditation, that if eyes, mugs, elephants, the dependent arisings that even a child can point out, that's a mug, that's an elephant, or not, that's an eye, right? If they were already in their own nature, then the path would be meaningless, because even a mind afflicted with ignorance would be perceiving that nature, right? So there would be, and also if this was as it is, then it would be available for us to cling on to it, because it is as it appears. So then there would be no enlightenment, and there would be no path, and there would be no freedom from suffering, from samsara. But because they are not there, as they appear, they are not there in nature, and conventionality doesn't establish them ultimately, then there is a path, and there is a purpose, and there is enlightenment. So the nature that we're talking about here, not the ignorant one, but the ultimate one, is in compared to conventional truths, is not fabricated and not dependent. And not only that, we could argue the case that only something which is not fabricated, only something that ignorance could obscure from us, right, is suitable to be such a nature. So therefore, we could argue that it's neither an intrinsic thing nor an intrinsic non-thing, because an intrinsic non-thing is meaningless as well. It's simply just it's just in its own nature. So that point is, I think I might, we might cover this in a bit, but the point is, it's a bit like recognizing sort of dependent arising. Okay, causes the continual play of cause and effect, the continual flow of impermanence, And if we were to say, well, what causes cause and effect, we're missing the point. So similarly, what we're saying is that we're not denying the cause and effect. We can't deny the cause and effect. Cause and effect is what demonstrates nature and demonstrates conventionality and demonstrates the emptiness of inherent existence. So these sorts of things are definitely present, but if we start using words like exist, non-exist, inherent, non-inherent, we get into trouble, because we're describing the way in which things are. We're not able to directly point to them with language. So when we and this is going back again, so when we're looking at when we determine that phenomena, anything that comes to mind, anything that lacks even a whisper of intrinsic existence, we might see this absence appearing as an attribute of the phenomenon that we're examining. So when let's say I'm here using this blue mug as the basis of my analysis into intrinsic nature, I've managed to identify the way in which my ignorance perceives it as being naturally existent. I'm able to remove that through analysis. I'm able to then point out that it is only a fiction when I see it that way. The way in which that appears, because I'm using a sort of conceptual, or a sort of a mixture of conceptual and consideration and concentration at the same time, is it appears that the absence of the if you like, the emptiness of the cup is sort of an attribute of it. So we're seeing, at the same time, we're seeing the cup being now, and we're also knocking it in terms of its absence. So we're talking, this is in terms of our experience when we're meditating on emptiness. So we see this thing where we can see it being present, then we establish the way in which ignorance dresses it, then we recognize how that is fabrication through reasoning. And that leaves us with a sort of a dual awareness, one of the cup as it appears, but also one of this sort of lacking this particular quality that we superimpose upon it. So Rinpoche makes the point, it's not really contradictory for our mind to hold both the attribute and the underlying truth. In other words, the mug and the emptiness of the self of mug, the emptiness of intrinsic existence of the mug, it's not contradictory for us to do that. But while we're still holding on to this dualistic appearance, the lacking that we perceive as an experientially conceptual. It's a conceptual experience rather than a direct experience. We're not directly experiencing emptiness at that point. We're recognizing conceptually, we're recognizing emptiness. And this isn't useless. It's absolutely not useless. In fact, it's the first step. At this point, we've already developed, we've already passed through this recognition that you know, in a sense, Santa isn't here, and that the thing that we hold on to isn't present. So that sort of moment of grief, is we're beyond that. We're now using our understanding, our analysis, to eliminate the projected sense of emptiness we put, projected sense of inherent existence we put on things, self-nature we put on things. When we do that, we see this slightly dualistic, the sort of the double, both the cup and the non-cup. The concept that we know it's a conventional cup, we see the conventional cup and we also see the absence of inherent existence of that conventional cup, and that itself is the dualistic conceptual access of emptiness. It's experiential, it's still making a difference, but it's not directly experiential. So by working on this and developing it, becoming more and more familiar with it, we can then develop our concentration, because what we find is when we do that, when we actually begin to meditate on the emptiness of something, we are left with this, it arises from analysis, but it destroys conceptuality by its nature. So we find ourselves with this sort of more able to actually develop a stronger understanding. So one of the things, if we find ourselves becoming more confused, we've not yet quite clearly got what it is we're looking for. If we only see the object, we haven't quite got it there. If we end up adding more and more words to try to understand it, then we're going into intellectualization. So when we get it correct, then what happens is our mind becomes there's less thinking going on, there's less conceptuality. There's still conceptuality present, right? So this, even when we have calm abiding mind, a serenity, at first we see this dualistic. But when we familiarize ourselves with that, then that becomes less and less conceptual, and in the end we get this direct insight, and that's the moment of where we become Arya beings, where we are enlightened, or our first step of enlightenment. So at this point, this direct perception it stops any elaborations completely of essential existence. We don't see any essential existence there at all, not even an echo of it. There's an entire stopping of all mistaken appearance of essential existence. And therefore, Rinpoche, there's quite a long talk into this, Rinpoche says, well, if we accept that we are now recognizing the final nature, how would we say that that sort of nature is inherent or essentially existent? Doesn't make any sense. So yeah, so going back, this is what I was talking about earlier on. So it's important for us to not be imagining, which we find in some Buddhist traditions, that the ultimate truth or the natural mode of things, free of ignorance, is some sort of transcendent reality, or that it's a sort of some sort of reality, like in the film The Matrix, you take the red pill and you find a totally different reality behind it. It's not like that. It's not like in the film. The point is that if we were to do that, we would be merely replacing one set of conventions with another, and we're not, right? One might argue that this is, if one's familiar with Tantra, that this is what is found in the Vase initiation, and I might agree. But while the Vase initiation might replace a set of conventions with another set of conventions, neither of them are more true than the other, and nor are they either of them demonstrate the ultimate truth or reveal the ultimate truth, right? So when we understand emptiness, then in terms of even at a conceptual level, then the Vase initiation can be very useful for our practice, but it does not reveal to us a deeper understanding or a deeper underlying truth. So the way in which things appear when we have a direct perceptual, a direct experience of emptiness, is one which is does not assert, this is how things are, or it doesn't, or this is how things aren't, right? So again, if we remember that ultimate truth determines causation, If it were a fiction, then it couldn't do that. So causation and also impermanence we recognize as being omnipresent with all things, including minds, as well as matter. So this ultimate truth is where we can find the basis of causation and also the basis of impermanence and so on. So, you know, we'd have this problem, which is if dependence arising itself was a dependent arising, where would it come from? So we recognize it as a dependent designation in terms of when we're talking about it. So in terms of a convention, when we're talking in the way in which I'm talking about it now, we have to say these are conventional truths, hence the conventional truth claim made earlier on. But as far as I said, the way in which I prefer to see the way in this tathata, the ultimate reality, is just a continual play of dependent arising itself. So this continual play of cause and effect and impermanence. So when we recognize this as being the underlying sort of quantum foam of cause and consequence, then we see that there is no way in which developing an understanding of emptiness frees us from karma directly. We still are subject to cause and consequence. So then we understand, and this allows for us to understand, that when we talk about a Buddha being free of karma, we're saying they are free of samsara karma that leads to suffering. Definitely, no problem. But to say a Buddha would be free of karma it completely would mean they were able to do things that were causeless, and that's just not true, just not possible. So we have to, this helps us understand a little bit about these ultimate big picture things, which normally we don't need to worry about in our practice. So while we've been talking, finishing the chapter in terms of the nature of ultimate truth, I think the first part of this chapter, which is clear that we've got to eliminate the ignorance as we experience it, rather than merely reason about what consequences arise from some sort of intellectual sort of understanding. And this is both relevant and crucial to us. Reasoning is important; it's absolutely necessary for us in our journey. But he's at pains to point out that we mustn't get lost in our intellectuality. The goal is experiential, sort of experiential experience. Sorry, the goal is experiential anyway, like that. So while the insight section of the Lam Rim does contain lots of reasoning and some really quite mind-bending ideas, in the end we've really got to sort of shut up, sit down, get on with the work, right? So this is like a teacher, right? Shut up, sit down, get on with your work. Our work is to tread the path and to recognize our ignorance and to defeat it. That's the part that is insight. So we're going to recognize our ignorance, destroy it. We don't want to be compassionate towards ignorance. Ignorance is the cause of all suffering. We need to be compassionate with those who are suffering from ignorance. So in that sense, we've got to recognize how our ignorance muddies our mind, actually see it, and then recognize how inappropriate it is in our life. Right, this type of perception is how toxic and inappropriate it is to sustain ignorance. So we can't give up on reason. We've got to use reason to recognize what it is we're looking for. We've got to use reason to help us once we've found it, to eliminate it, to destroy it, and to give us clarity about how it's inappropriate. So the middle way school and the Majjhima Marga school definitely has reasoning is its methodology. And what's so clever about it, really very, very clever, is that we don't depend upon philosophies in order to do that. We don't need to imagine the world being this way or that. We're going to be using reasoning alone to show that ignorance is, that the projection that we put onto things, this what we call self, is impossible. And being impossible means it's not there, not present for us. Okay, so next week we're actually going to be, so that was really what it isn't, yeah? We're saying what we must not do. And then next week we're going to, or next session, we're going to be doing what actually it is that we're looking for. So it'll be, hopefully it'll be very exciting for us. It'll be exciting for me anyway. So then finally, let's put some thought into determining that we are going to make a difference, even if Ben spoke a lot of stuff that is confusing to us, or even to himself. What we're wanting to do is to use our will and be determined to make a difference, and to recognize that we have this illusion, according to Buddha, and that we are going to remove it. So this is very, very central to Path, and very, very central to the path of all Buddhist practice. So let's work on that, you know, in our own ways or with our own study as well, definitely. But the idea is to recognize what is it that keeps me trapped. Yeah. All right, so let's now finish with a short sit, maybe on looking to see if we can find what it is within ourselves that is so precious to us, or who it is, if you like, and what it looks like to us. How does this ignorance manifest itself? And if we already know enough about the analysis methods for to demonstrate its ignorance, then we can use that too.